What happens after you drop a PC from a 3-story building? Is there any way that even a single component within this computer still functions? I mean, surely not, right? Well, as it turns out, the answer might just surprise you. And to fully explain what happens, first, we need to start at the beginning. The experiment began like this. Drop a PC from a single inch high, and if it survives, double the height. And well, let's just say things got off to a rough start. After 1 inch high, the experiment ended as quickly as it started. Until thankfully, the computer rebooted and ran as normal, so then it was time to double the height to 2 inches. And honestly, at this point, I think the PC had something to prove. 2 inches, check. 4 inches, no problem. 8 inches, still kicking. 16 inches, not a worry in the world. But at 32 inches, we see gravity start to fight back. Not only does our case's front panel snap off completely, but our CPU fan needs a jump start to continue spinning. That said, the computer is still posting, so time to increase the height to 64 inches. And by some miracle, our PC survives the overhead drop. And at this point, we've reached our indoor height limit, and so it's time to take things outside. With the help of a ladder and my puppy Deuce, we can now drop the PC from 128 inches. Look out below. After the crushing impact of a 10-foot fall, all it took was a system reset for every component to continue to work as normal, which is fascinating. But unfortunately, the same cannot be said after our next drop of 256 inches. If I haven't mentioned don't try this at home, now's a good time to say don't try this at home. And if you're squeamish about tech gore, now's the time to look away. Our CPU cooler is obliterated, with the heatsink being completely launched from the case. And even worse than that, our PCIe slot has been completely torn off. Safe to say our computer is no longer recognizing any type of graphics card output. But it's not about how hard you fall, it's about how many times you get back up. And if we instead swap our output from our GPU to our CPU's integrated graphics, we can see that there's still life in this computer. As long as we can get to BIOS, I'm considering this computer still functional, which means now we need to increase the drop to 512 inches. And while I don't personally have a 40-foot building to drop the PC off of, I might just know someone who does.
Let's see what happens.
Welcome to the roof of my good friend, Austin Evans. Standing at over 3 stories tall, it's the perfect height for our 512-inch drop. And they say madness is a lot like gravity. All it takes is a little push. My goodness. Just like that, we find ourselves in the parking lot with a pile of crumpled up computer. And despite our best efforts to resuscitate it, no matter what we try, the computer simply won't respond. But our story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just getting started, because the goal of this video is to figure out what happens after the crash. And if we carefully transport our crumpled computer back to the tech tinkering studio, it's time to figure out which of this computer's 10 components are in fact broken, and which components, if any, have somehow survived by the grace of Linus himself. And if you think you know which ones will work and which ones won't, let me tell you, you're gonna be in for a surprise. But first, we need to extract each component from this mangled PC case. And starting with the power supply, I don't think we should be making that rattling sound. But thankfully, all the cables unplugged from the motherboard nicely. I honestly don't know how this thing hasn't exploded yet. You can see it start to bulge at the corners here. Hiding behind our GPU, we can find the bottom half of our CPU heatsink, which other than being totally detached from the rest of the cooler, does seem to be in halfway decent shape. As for the top half of our cooler though, this has certainly seen better days. I know the stock Intel cooler gets a lot of hate, but come on, no cooler deserves the fate of being torn in half like this. Now the hard drive will be really interesting. Hard drives store their data on such fragile disks that you'd have to imagine that there's no way this works anymore. But at least visually from the outside, it doesn't look that battered at all. And importantly, the SATA pins look completely normal. They're not bent out at all. That said, the true test will be if the inside disks aren't just completely shattered. I have much more hope for the SSD that was in this computer, because despite this drive getting thrashed around as much as the hard drive, internally there's no actual moving parts, and again, the pins look totally normal. So that's a good sign. Now it's time to extract our GPU, and despite the PCIe slot being completely torn off, the GPU is still being secured in the back of the case with a couple screws. Turns out these screws go a long way in securing your GPU so it doesn't rattle around too much, especially in the case of a 512-inch drop. And with that, our GPU is free. It's kind of crazy to see the PCIe slot cover just coming along with it. You can also see how bent up the heatsink is on this GPU. I can fit my entire finger between the metal and the fans. And speaking of fans, the right one appears to spin freely, while the left one is running into some issues. Evidently, the bent heatsink underneath it is preventing it from spinning. But again, the true question is this damage enough to prevent the GPU itself from continuing to work? It's quite a bit of physical damage, but honestly, the most of it appears to be on the fans and the heatsink itself. And so if those took the brunt of the force over the PCB, which contains the actual GPU chip, then there might be a sliver of hope that the graphics card will still turn on. Moving on to the next PCIe card, our Wi-Fi adapter honestly might look the most normal out of any component that we pulled out so far. Unlike with the GPU, this card was able to avoid having its PCIe cover completely pulled off with it. And somehow the antennas also just stayed totally intact. Now the RAM is going to be interesting. You can clearly see the left RAM stick is a little bit more bent than the right one. But upon closer inspection, it appears that most of that bentness is just from the heatsink itself, not the actual PCB. And because the heatsink isn't mandatory for the RAM to work, we might have dodged a bullet with this one as well. Alright, we've extracted as much as we can. It's time to pull out the motherboard, which at this point is quite literally sandwiched within the bent metal of the case. And so after a bit of prying, it finally comes loose. And my goodness, look at that bend. I've never seen a motherboard so warped. What's crazy is that the PCB material that motherboards are made out of is so hard to bend without breaking. So it's actually wild that it has this curve to it without it being completely torn off. That said, on the back side of the motherboard, we can see that this bend might actually be impacting some of these traces, which might be very significant because if we track these traces, we can see they just might be responsible for the video output. This is crazy too. I've never actually seen a PCIe slot without its cover. And to think all these exposed pins are responsible for communicating with the graphics card. Well, I guess we're responsible. And finally, can't forget about our CPU, which happens to be an i7-3770, seemingly still in perfect condition. I was concerned all the crazy impacts might have scratched the underside connectors, but take a look, all of these pads look flawless. My money's on the CPU working 100%. The socket seems to have done a pretty good job of protecting the CPU, that is, at least in the visual inspection. And now with the internal components extracted, we can finally see the true damage done to the case. And my goodness, talk about absorbing the brunt of the load. This kind of metal is not that easy to bend. This is honestly crazy. And now it's time to begin our troubleshooting. Let's reassemble the computer with all of its original components except for the rattling power supply, which we'll replace with one that we know functions properly. And as janky as it is, it's ready to be tested yet again. And so as we short out the pins, we can see that it still fails to function. If we take a close look, we can see the motherboard LED blink on and off. This means that the motherboard is receiving some amount of power but can't sustain it. And because we know this new power supply works, it raises some additional concerns with this motherboard, which will have to be the next thing we replace in our troubleshooting. Thankfully, I have one other LGA 1155 motherboard in my studio. And if it looks familiar to you, it's because it's the same setup I use to test all of the crazy thermal paste alternatives that you guys suggest. So safe to say, our replacement motherboard has seen some stuff. And now after installing our CPU, RAM, and SSD from our dropped computer, we're ready to run our next test. So as we flip on the power supply, we can see that the fan spins to life. That's further than we've gotten so far, so I'm counting it as a good omen. The issue though is while the fan keeps spinning, there's no signal being output. And so I waited and waited, but things still weren't looking good. Is it really the case that none of these components survived this experiment? Throughout all the tech tinkering I do on this channel, I've learned that computer parts are just so much more resilient than we think they are. And so I just wasn't ready to give up hope quite yet. And thank goodness I didn't, because after 10 minutes of watching this computer spin with no output, the most amazing thing happened.
Oh my gosh, no way, we got a signal, we got a signal.
That, my friend, is a sight for sore eyes. It means that there's at least some life left in these components, but might just be a sliver, because some of the output it was producing was unlike anything I'd ever seen. But at this point, my confidence is through the roof, so let's throw everything we have at this for one final test. All those weird artifacts on screen more than likely indicate a RAM issue, so we'll start by simply reseating those sticks. While we're at it, we'll also just unplug and replug in our SSD, as well as reintroduce our hard drive for the first time. We'll also whip out the Wi-Fi adapter and plug that into one of the open PCIe slots, as well as break out our bent up GPU, which we'll have to plug into the lower PCIe slot so we have room for the Wi-Fi card. And now with nearly every component from our broken PC neatly installed, it's time to flip on the power one last time. And wouldn't you know it, the computer spins to life. Let's go, that is so awesome. Better yet, when we dig a little deeper, we see the CPU is recognized correctly. All 8 gigs of RAM are recognized correctly. Our hard drive is recognized correctly, which means the hard drive survived every single one of those falls. What? The SSD is recognized correctly? The Wi-Fi adapter works? And the cherry on top, the GPU is also recognized correctly. And what might just be the cherry on top of the cherry is that I was also able to get the mangled Intel stock cooler to function properly as well. You'll love to see it. So in conclusion, after dropping this computer 10 times at the max height of 512 inches, the motherboard and power supply did perish, but every single other component in the computer continues to function completely as normal.
That's freaking incredible.
These kind of outcomes are quite literally why I'm so motivated to do these tech tinkering experiments, because you can learn some pretty incredible things if you're willing to do something ridiculous. Thank you so much for joining me on this tech tinkering adventure. I hope you had just as much fun as I did. As always, I'm Mr. Yeaster, and I'll catch you in the next one.